Going live. And there we are. Now, let's. All right. I am live in all three places. I've got Facebook there, Facebook over here, YouTube over here. So we're just waiting now for Brock Holler's joined. He's here. Yeah, I'll be looking at three different screens to see names and things when they pop up. And I'll give people just a few more minutes to kind of crash the party. And who will join us. Okay. And then I've got other notices that'll come up on my iPhone of people that are joining. I put it up on my regular Facebook public, so there I will have friends who will be viewing this also from off my things. And these are friends, of course, that aren't really been a part of, let's say, the eschatology arguments and stuff going back. So, they're going to be a little bit lost in some of this, but that's okay, right, Michael? And Michael's a good friend. And but hopefully they can kind of follow along and kind of grasp a little bit of what's going on here. And let me see. I'm filling some notes out. Let's see. Yep, I got the link in different places, of course, and I've tried to put it everywhere that I can so that people can join in. Hey, Michael Zabel, yeah. What's going on? No, I don't. I'm just what I'm going to be doing tonight, of course, is going through Don Preston's book of Like Father, Like Son, and just having a good discussion time on that, and point some things out that I went through the book very carefully, very, very carefully. And I'm going to plug this one into the speaker so that if anybody comes on, they'll be loud enough that everybody can hear them. And now I think, yep, I've got a few more people I've all joined in there. And 602. Let's see. I don't know if Lance is going to be joining me on the phone right away or not. And yeah, he can't join us right now. So anybody else needs to message me if they're able to join me, if they want to do that through the phone. I can add you on here as part of it. And I was looking for somebody who's actually read the book, like Joel or somebody that can actually respond with me on that, who's read Like Father, Like Son. And I don't know if nobody's on YouTube. And I've got the others here on the Facebook. Okay. And I got the camera there. I got both cameras sitting side by side. So if I look over here, I turn sideways. So I got to stay focused here. But the chat stuff is over there. So every now and then I'll be looking back over there. And I've written out some notes and some things. And I think I'll be ready to start here in just a minute or two. Because this will be recorded. It will be up on YouTube. And anybody else that you want to join to look at it. And of course, if anybody wants to get on the phone, if I can add them, I will try to add them. I know that I'm on Coming Out of Full Preterism on there, and I did the link on Sam's page and just about everywhere else. so they can join. And actually, nobody's on YouTube right now, but we do have it on Facebook Live, so that'll be fine. And on my other people, okay. Well, if anybody wants to, I'm looking at comments here. If anybody wants to join me live through Facebook, just go ahead and send the message and all of that, and I will bring you online with me. We can do that too. All right. It is now 6:05, and I think I can get going and get started. For those of you who have read Don's book, Like Father, Like Son, it's a study, he says, of the nature of the second coming. And I'm going to bring out a couple of things first before we actually dive into some of the quotes and go through some of those things. I've got a small list here to go through of main topic points and talking points. And then also I will be going to his book and pulling out some quotes and dealing with those quotes and just showing the different things. Now, and I'm not going to be mean. I'm not here to slam Don Preston and call him names or say how terrible he is or anybody else's. That is not my point whatsoever. But just to show the differences between traditional theology. Now, if anybody's seen my last video, one of them I did was I talked about the churches of Christ. And if you see any of Don's posting and when he talks about it, when he talks about futures, that we couldn't jettison church history or get away from the creeds and those different things. And it seems kind of inconsistent. And I talked about that, how we're supposed to have scholarship and supposed to learn from other people. And so the early church fathers wrote things so that we can learn from them. But then Don Preston and the others will write things and do videos to teach other people, but somehow or another, we're not supposed to listen to them. And there's no demonstration, of course, that they were in apostasy or anything else, because these are the same men who formulated the doctrine of the incarnation and the Trinity. So not giving a background and not having a background in theology or systematic theology, the problem, of course, would be, I got to read notes in between here. The problem, of course, would be is they don't have that background to draw on. And if you don't read other scholars, period, then you're not going to know their theology. You don't know, and you're not going to be able to understand what it is that they talked about before. I made this up. Let's see if it comes out right. No. Yeah, there. In the one, it does. I reversed it, and it's not showing up in the other one. But the idea is this. When I sit there and I say to somebody, add these two digits together, and I give you 2 + 2, somebody who has no background whatsoever in mathematics is going to go, oh, well, add 2 and 2 together, that's 22. You put the two numbers together. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? Versus somebody who's done theology or mathematics, 2 + 2, of course, equals 4. And I can say the same thing. Add these two digits together. I can say that for both the same ways. And, of course, we're going to get two different types of answers from people. For the one, he writes them together, and then, of course, the other one, he adds them together. So that's the difference in hermeneutics. That's the different perspective of how people look at it and put it together. Now, as a background, one of the first things that I want to address is that there are two basic, very basic theologies that he talks about and touches on in the one. But in the first one, it's anthropology, of course, the study of man and his creation. I'm not going to go through all the notes and everything else. I am working on another book and putting this all together, so this is kind of where this is coming from, some of it. But the idea is that anthropology, when we go to Genesis 1, and this is for Jen Fishburne, because she wanted to know what I was talking about here had anything to do with creation, and this is it. When man was created in the garden, he was created body, soul, and spirit. God made him from the dust. God breathed on him, and he became a living creature or creation. And the idea is body, soul, and spirit. And it was Paul who later also said that that we would preserve ourselves, body, soul, and spirit, blameless. Now, the idea is that in the study of man, that's how God made man. Now, if we compare to how angels were created, they were created differently. It says no such thing about them being created physically, bodily, with a spirit or any other things. All we know is that angels are created beings, and they're not man. Man is created body, soul, and spirit, and God, of course, is spirit. He is not in flesh, and he can appear and disappear anytime he wishes to. But it is man who is made body, soul, and spirit. That is the foundation for understanding what man is. So if we are man, body, soul, and spirit, then the whole process of what everything is going on, life and creation and life to the very end, and all of those things, death and then resurrection. The whole point of that is to come before God blameless with the body, soul, and spirit, all three parts. If we go to Revelations and we talk about resurrection, see, here's one of the inconsistencies. We're talking about the resurrection of the just and the unjust. It is a resurrection of both of them. You cannot say that the first resurrection, of course, is being born again, because if the unjust are being born again, then you're teaching universalism and everybody is saved. And I don't think that's what we're doing. That's what we're talking about, is it? The other thing is, if the unjust and the just are being resurrected for judgment, then it has to be the same type of resurrection. After that great white throne, of course, we go into the new heavens and earth, where after the judgment, of course, the good people go to heaven and the bad people go to the lake of fire. If we're in heaven with God, what does it say in Revelations 21 and 22? That we come back to this earth, and the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven, and God looks at man and is with man face to face. So that's future theology, is that man was created body, soul, and spirit. And in the end, we are body, soul, and spirit when we stand on this earth and fellowship. Now, we're talking about then, of course, this is the restoration. God's not throwing things away. He's restoring everything back to the original creation, the way that God intended it to be, and the way he created it to be in the garden. Now, we can talk about covenant creation and some of those things those guys have brought up and talked about. Was there death in the garden? And no, there cannot be. It's simply impossible. Lions did not eat each other because the verse right there in First Genesis says that animals were given fruit of the trees to eat. There was no death. The tree of life didn't represent them living because they were going to die. It represented the fact that they could eat of that tree in obedience and live. It couldn't be any different than if they ate of the tree of good and evil. Did that make them good or evil? Or was that because of the choice and the knowledge of knowing what's right and wrong? So anthropology, in a nutshell, is understanding the basis that man is body, soul, and spirit. Now, in the incarnation, in that doctrine, Preston, of course, all the way through his books, acknowledges that. That's what he came for, was to be incarnate and to be a man. And for the sake of dying for people on the cross, and so it was all physical. And then afterwards, of course, when he ascended up, he teaches that Jesus became a spirit in a spirit form. And those are some things that we'll talk through a little bit later on. But in the traditional view and understanding of the incarnation is that Jesus became man. That's why you can have Paul talking about Jesus in 1 Timothy. There's only one mediator between God and man, and that man is Jesus Christ. See, in the doctrine of the deity and the incarnation, the Trinity, Jesus, is both fully man and fully God. He has a divine nature, and he has the fully nature of man also, and it's existed within one body. And of course, his body was never fallen in the sense that he was born spiritually dead or born into sin. He was sinless. And that's part of the doctrine of understanding why he was born of a virgin and not through the line of Adam. Do you understand that? That's why you can say one man came from Adam, one came from, is heavenly born, meaning that Jesus is not born in the line of Adam, where that sin nature was passed on to him, and he was born into sin. And that's a very important distinction there. But the idea then, of course, is that in his incarnation, he never loses that, never stops being a man, no matter what. Now that he has become a man, well, let's argue it this way. Me being a man, I can never become a god. I can never become an angel. If I die, there's nothing that can make me become a man or an angel. I will always be a man. And the same thing, Jesus now is a man. He will always be a man. He can't stop being a man because that was the way he was made. But he is also God. He cannot stop being God because he's a man. But he will always be God and fully God at the same time. So if anybody has questions, of course, I'm bringing up something, yeah. Feel free to write a comment and ask, and I can respond back and forth to it. And if there's anybody else who, let me see if I have, no, I'm looking to see if there was anybody else who, yeah, if I can, anybody else wanted to get online with me, phone call. I didn't know if Joel was here or who else, but I was hoping that, somebody might be able to sit and interact so I don't sound like I'm going on forever and ever. Now, with those two things in mind, those two things form the basis of all theologies. You can never have Jesus not being a man. That soteriology, that anthropology, that carries all the way through with his incarnation, his deity, up into the very end of time in the Bible. And I'm not trying to argue all of the other things just yet. I want to get into now, with those backgrounds, I'm going to go into Don's, some of the quotes that I pulled up from him, and I'm going to be kind of working my way through the book. And there's some things I'm going to deal with and some things that I'm not going to from the book. I'm trying to bring out the highlights and the most important things. And why there's that difference of theology, starting with that anthropology and the incarnation, understanding those two bases. And then also, of course, there's one other thing that will come up in a basis in his doctrine and the way he teaches and the things he presents. And this is this. He talks about sinful flesh. And I put up a quote yesterday. Some of those people, some of the other guys saw it. But it was a direct quote. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It was a direct quote from, no, I didn't pull it up there, from N.T. Wright when he talks about it. And the idea is that in Gnostic thinking, and this is going to sound completely familiar to any full preterists. In Gnostic thinking, you had the physical and then you had the spiritual. The two of them never met. The physical was a waste of time. That wasn't what was real. It was always the spiritual that was real. That was the part that was the lasting. The two worlds never met. And of course, you'll have the preterists say, the natural came first and then the spiritual. That is the basis of Gnostic thought. N.T. Wright, in his book of Surprised by Hope, he begins and ends with the idea that man was not created to live on clouds strumming on harps forever. Heaven was not created for man. Earth was created for man. God created man so that man could have fellowship with God, God with man. And earth was created for that place to be so that we can enjoy the face-to-face fellowship. And that is what Revelation 21:22 talks about, is that face-to-face fellowship. So there is a combining of heaven and earth. That's reflected in several passages, but maybe the main one is the Lord's Prayer. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And there is to be a joining of earth and heaven in the final end. And That's something that is very Jewish in thought. It comes from all the way across the board, but the idea of physical, then the spiritual, and the physical is dead and bad and sinful, sinful flesh that Don talks about is evil, and so forth. They always want to keep it separate apart, but God never did that. So, getting to, and I think some of you guys know a little bit of my beliefs and what I've said before, and I am, of course, got that Middleism .org website that presents some of this thing. But then going to, so there's some of that background you might already know about. But I'll interact a little bit when I go through his quotes here. So the first one here that I'm going to bring out, Don says, there is no need to make excuses for Jesus or the Bible. There is a simpler biblical answer. Jesus did not predict that he was coming back on a literal cloud to destroy the cosmos. Jesus said he was going to come in the glory of his Father, and this means Jesus was going to be revealed as God and not as man at his parousia. This means he could not come again in the flesh. And this work will demonstrate that truth as well as to respond to those who call this view heresy. Now, why we call it heresy if it's what is Christianity is that Christ will return bodily, physically, to bodily physical resurrection. That is what Christianity has been since the very beginning. And the early church fathers all the way through have understood that and have taught that and have believed that and argued from scriptures for that. So it's not like they just make it up out of thin blue air. But I wanted to point out of all, to come in the glory of his Father. Of course, this comes from Matthew 24, and this is when they're talking about the events of AD 70. Now, I believe that AD 70 and the events completely fulfills the Olivet. All of it is done. It's all fulfilled, the whole thing. And of course, the counteract is, well, if you believe in that, then you believe that it was the second coming. And here it is in the nutshell for you. The coming of Jesus in that day, of course, as Don describes it, I agree with him. It was not about a physical bodily coming of Jesus. It was about, just like his Father in the Old Testament, it was God who came on the clouds in judgment, sent an army to carry out his judgment against another nation. So therefore, that nation then would be destroyed according to the word of the Lord. And it never required for Jesus to come down or God to come down or anybody else to come down and be seen or any other thing. And I've had this kind of discussion with Don Preston about some of that the idea is parousia has two meanings, two usages. And I don't think no, I'm not going to. But as I'm talking about then, of course, the Son of Man coming on glory is an Old Testament type of alliteration of what's going on here. The Son of Man, of course, is his self-title, coming on clouds, like in form of judgment. But when Jesus actually says that, he is actually quoting from Daniel 7:13 and 14. And here's where I want to read and present something to you. And I want you to kind of listen to this. I want to bring up, see, a week or so ago, Don Preston presented two books. One of them was from Dr. Jimmy Henry, Eyewitness of His Majesty. Now, this is a preterist, a full preterist, and he's a doctor of preterism. And so here's the one quote I pulled out of him. He says this: since LaHaye and I agree that Jesus quotes from Daniel 7:13, analyzing what the passage actually says will be helpful. Notice that the coming of the Son of Man is up, not down. The destination is heaven, not earth. It is clear that Jesus was talking about his enthronement that took place when he ascended into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And this took place in AD 30, or when he died, of course, at his resurrection. That was the date he's good for. So somewhere between 30 and 33, of course, is when he ascended. And it was at this time that Jesus completed his mission and entered into the heaven itself by his own blood. Now, this is Dr. Jimmy Henry, who is talking about the Daniel 7, 13, 14 passage that I've said repeatedly, along with N.T. Wright, that the phrase Son of Man coming on clouds has nothing to do with the second coming. So we are not saying that Jesus lied about that coming. What we're saying is that the coming that Jesus was talking about there was not about a second coming, but his coming to earth to sit at the right hand. Because he sits at the right hand and he has the right to judge, he will send judgment. And that judgment will come on Israel, the Jerusalem and the temple 40 years later in AD 70. Now, I come next in the Michael Miano posted an article written by William Bell. And of course, he taught Frost's understanding of the Daniel 7 passage. Now, this is what William Bell stated. Okay, now listen very closely. The meaning of Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is found not in the vision per se, but in the words revealed by the angel. In other words, ignore what it says in 13 and 14. That's just a vision. But you got to go down later in the chapters and understand what it's talking about, because the angel explains what the vision was about. So Bell says what the angel described following Daniel's headache is not an ascension scene, but a judgment scene that is historically placed within the days of the fourth beast, national Israel, the little horn, who makes war with the saints until the time comes for the saints to possess the kingdom. Okay, I hope you can see it. There's your contradictions right there. Here's two full preterists talking about the same passage. One says it is an ascension scene. The others say it is not. It's a judgment scene. And of course, what we're saying as a futurist is that it is an ascension scene where he sits down, and because he has the right to judge from John 5, he issues judgment. This is why in Matthew 26, when he was standing before Caiaphas, and he said, from now on, you will see the Son of Man. You're going to see the events that are going to follow. You will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand, which means you'll kill me. I will ascend to the Father, and then coming on clouds. And he is using that Old Testament language specifically of talking about, I will go and sit at the right hand of the Father. He was saying, in quoting this, he was claiming to be the Messiah right there in front of Caiaphas, and basically saying, you're killing me, but I'm going to ascend into heaven. I'm going to sit on the throne, and you will see me coming on the clouds. You will see the judgment that comes because of I've received dominion. He receives the kingdom. That's when he got it all. So there's your first contradiction. Here's what N.T. Wright says. First, when Jesus speaks of Son of Man coming on the clouds, he is talking not about the second coming, but in line with the Daniel 7 text, he is quoting about the vindication after suffering. The coming is an upward, not a downward movement. See, he's agreeing with Dr. Jimmy Henry, who's a preterist. In context, the key text means that though Jesus is going to his death, he will be vindicated by events that will take place afterward. What the events are remain cryptic from the point of view of the passage in question, well, which is a good reason for thinking them authentic, but they certainly include both Jesus' resurrection and the destruction of the temple, the system that opposed him and his mission. There's the two of them right there. There's the whole thing that he's talking about, and this is what it is definitely talking about. So getting back to a repeated phrase all the way through the book, Don keeps going back to the idea that he is going to come in the glory of his Father. Well, let me explain one other thing. When somebody comes in the glory of the Father, that means he's coming in the good reputation of his Father. It doesn't mean, glory does not mean invisible or something invisible. Even in the Old Testament, we know that it was God who led them by a cloud during the day, and it was a pillar of fire at night, or a cloud of fire that they saw at night. There was always the presence of God. They always saw him. Now, and then, of course, there was times when that glory cloud came down and settled on the temple, and everybody had to leave, and the glory of the Lord filled the place. But it was something that was visual. They saw this. Later on, Don talks about, God is in spirit, and no man has seen God. And Paul says that no man has seen God. But our problem is that we go to Genesis 24, and if I was pulled up the verse, it says that Abihu, Moses, Aaron, and 70 elders went up on top of the mountain, and they beheld. I'm going to read it. I've got to pull it up real quick here on my computer, and I do 90% of everything on my computer. So in Exodus 24, it says, then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, those are the sons of Aaron, and 70 elders of the Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate rank. So this is what we call a Christophany. This is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus himself that showed up, because we have to take seriously what does it say? No man has seen God and lived. No man has seen God. But here we're saying that we have seen God. Well, because Jesus is God, we can sit there and say they saw the God of Israel. They saw the pre-incarnate vision of this wasn't even a vision. This is the pre-incarnate form of Jesus that they saw and they interacted with. So this argument that he comes in the glory of his Father and he's not seen, and because no man has seen God, that whole argument completely falls apart. And of course, secondly, of the idea that it was Jesus who is God who became flesh. So that completely breaks apart from the Old Testament days and how that comes. So the glory of his Father means he comes in the good reputation of his Father. Now, one of the next things that Don deals with is the whole idea of timing dictates the nature. Let me go through my quotes, though. I might be jumping ahead of myself a little bit, and I don't want to do too much. This next one comes from about 642. He does not have page numbers. The whole formatting between a book and a Kindle, if you're not paying attention when you load it up there, completely can scramble it. And his book here got completely scrambled. So he puts in here, the epiphany of Jesus was not to reveal him as man, but as God. And as such, we contend that it would be impossible for Jesus to appear in the flesh. No one has seen God at any time. See, there's the verse that he's using. No one has seen God, but that's not true. Genesis 24, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. So yes, they have seen God, but he's talking about no man has seen God the Father, correct? But Jesus has seen the Father, and he's come back. And so now if you've seen Jesus, you have seen the Father. For Jesus to be revealed as God and not man has direct implications for the nature of the parousia. Jesus' actions in history were to reveal him not in a body of flesh, but in the realm of the spirit. All right. Again, see those three elements there that I've talked about are the basis of what he's saying here. We contend that it is possible for Jesus to appear in the flesh. And I'll get into that argument why he says that much later on. Of course, besides the idea of nobody's seeing God, so therefore nobody's going to see him. For Jesus to be revealed as God, not man, has direct implications for the nature of the parousia. And of course, there's the Gnosticism saying that Jesus can't be man. He cannot be in the flesh because flesh is evil. Flesh is not good. So if he's going to be revealed, he's going to be revealed as God. And the problem, of course, with that is the very basic idea is that Jesus declared himself and showed himself to be God by his resurrection. That was the proof and the evidence that he was God. And he revealed himself in that resurrection. When he comes, because he is still fully man, according to that doctrine of the incarnation and anthropology, him still being a man, he never stops being a man. We don't see him right now, but he never quit, never ended up, and never stopped being a man and fully man. So when he comes, he must still be a man, and he is still God. So what's the implications then for the nature of the parousia? The parousia has two basic words, two meanings to it. And I got in this discussion with Don a long time ago, and boy, I'm hesitant even to go through there right now and do that and take the time to do this. But the idea is that Uh, it's used in two senses. And now Matthew used it in the one, of course, and this is what Don brings out in his book. Matthew is using it in the sense of talking about an Old Testament appearing of Jesus, or an Old Testament appearing of God when he shows up with the army and he does what he does. Because, see, the word is used by Josephus. It's used in the Septuagint in the book of Maccabees. In each case, it talks about an army coming on God's behalf to carry out judgment. Now, let me digress for just 1 second and deviate to another point that this is the inconsistency where we bring out in preterists. Let me see something here. I got, I want to deal with this if I can. And a question popped up real quick. And, oh, okay. He just mentioned that he's able to watch. Okay. So where was I at? Okay. Boy, I got to quit doing that. Lose my train of thought here. I was talking about the glory of the Father. I was talking about him showing up in the flesh. Because he is man and because of who he is, he's going to show up. And he's going to be revealed as God. Now, if somebody is in the spirit realm, how are they revealed to mankind on earth that it's going on in the spiritual realm? See, that's what doesn't make any sense. Okay, by division, I remember now where I was going. In the Old Testament, when God sent an army to go judge another nation, that's what he did. He sent the army. What's the picture that we have in 19? We have an army that is gathering against, in a general sense, against Jerusalem. And what army does God send to defeat that army that's gathering against the kingdom of the beast? It's Jesus and his army that comes to beat up that army of the beast. So put this in context. In 70 AD, God in judgment, or Jesus, sent an army, the Roman army, to go after Jerusalem. But in the picture of Revelation, the army comes, surrounds Jerusalem, and all of that happens. But before anything actually really happens, Jesus himself comes out of heaven with the saints. And that's Zechariah 14:4, First Thessalonians 3. He says that he comes with his saints, and that's confirmed. And of course, in Revelation 19, he comes with his saints. So when Jesus comes, he's not by himself. I don't think they realize that it is the dead who are coming with him as his army. That is what Revelation 19 is describing. So here Jesus comes with his army and defeats the beast. The beast and the false prophet are thrown alive into the lake of fire. So why would God send an army to judge Israel, the temple in Jerusalem, and then come himself in defense of the very army against the very army that he sent to do the damage anyway? Defeated spiritually? You say it's like in the Old Testament. In what case did an opposing army that destroyed a nation, did God send another army at the same time to destroy that army? That never ever happened. So we have that real inconsistency. So Jesus is coming to be revealed as God and man. And so this is the nature of the parousia, the nature. When we talk about the nature, this is how he was to come. Now, Don Preston then next goes into, in the book, he deals with the timing versus the nature. Timing dictates the nature. Now let's look at quotes of that, and we'll go through his argument. He said, the language of blessing is the opposite. It is worth noting that the time indicator of when the judgment was to occur was literal. The time statement was literal. The description of the day of the Lord was exaggerated language, metaphorical, he's saying. It used to emphasize the glory of God's actions. In other words, manner did not determine the time. Rather, time indicated the manner. Even more accurate, time statements were literal, descriptive language and metaphorical. Further, the prophet clearly did not believe that the use of such language stripped his prophecy of any meaning of power. Okay, get this. This is what Don is arguing. Because time statements are literal and his descriptions of the manner of which he was going to come is metaphorical. Therefore, the timing dictates how he's to come. Now, when you look through the book, not once does he go to the epistles and talk about the word epiphany or the word parousia. And I'm going to bring that up again and just lay that kind of real right out flat. The word epiphania, and he uses it and quotes it all the time, all the way through there, and brings up those scriptures about epiphania. Epiphania is the Greek word, of course, that means to be made visible, to manifest. Something that was hidden now appears, and it's translated all the time as appearing. 2 Thessalonians 2:8, at the appearing and coming of Jesus. And then the very next verse, it says the appearing of the lawless one. And that word there, of course, is also parousia. So we're not saying, and so think about it, the lawless one, is he appearing, or is Jesus appearing as an army, an earthly army that God is using to come and destroy another nation and another people? No, there's no sense of that whatsoever. I got another message here I got to look at real quick. Oh, man. Let me see if I can... I'm on live now. Let's see if we can... Okay. Hey, there. Now I can... Oh, I was not seeing their comments. Now I am seeing it. I didn't know... Okay, let me see.
To come and destroy another nation.
See, now you can. Okay, there we go. All right. Through air, some of the comments here, if you guys don't mind for a second, if I just go into this. He was writing on Facebook, and for some reason they didn't show up in my live content, and I don't know why. But here on the Facebook, it says, exactly, physical and spiritual are supposed to be together in very Jewish concept. Okay. The gospel is first all creation. Aaron Tyler, the problem is where it says Christ is in the flesh is a perfect active participle, complete act of the past, continuing he's still in the flesh, glorified, yes. So what Aaron is saying, of course, is the language there is the perfect active, that Christ is still in the flesh, he is still glorified. Yeah, I know that some people believe that there is a future fulfillment of 24. But the problem is, of course, I brought up before, how many times did Jesus feed the multitudes? There was one, 4,000, another one, 5, 7 loaves, 2 fishes. There's another one, there was 5 loaves, fishes or something. So there's 2 different things, but they're both similar events. And so they're both described in several events. What we have to do, and this is what I've done, is I've looked at all of Matthew 24 and answer, Aaron, is that when you go back to Zechariah 12 and 14, these are second coming passages that pretty much scholars all the way across agree on and are about the second coming. And in that scenario, and it talks about it specifically, and it's funny that Don will quote from there, but he will never quote the one passage that says, and God will protect the inhabitants, that the glory and this will have strength from the Lord, the inhabitants of Jerusalem will have strength from God. And they are the ones who are being protected. They're the ones who are being strengthened by God to get the victory over. And that's the idea of what happens in 19. It's the saints, it's them that wins and wins. Okay, now I can go back over here. I've seen some of those comments. Let's see if we can get all the, oh, there they are. Now I got them back all up. All right, so we're going back to, yes, so people are agreeing with that. My wife's telling me dinner is ready, but that's going to have to wait. So epiphany means to be made manifest and to be visible. So it doesn't matter if he's in spirit form, like in the Old Testament. Now, I want you to catch the power of this, as Don says. Even in the Old Testament, when Jesus appeared in a theophany, he simply appeared. He even ate and drank with them. So there's nothing to sit there and say that he will not appear. And when he appears, it's going to be in the glory of his Father, in the sense of his God, Father's got a glorious name, and now he does too, because he's the one who was resurrected and lives forevermore. And then that is the Epiphany, and of course, parousia. Now, this was the discussion I got with Don. Matthew used it one way in the Old Testament, but as we were talking about the parousia, how can the lawless one be a parousia? Because it's not talking about him coming with an army. Also, parousia is used with Stephanus and a couple of the verses where it was a person who was absent, who is now coming and being present. And Don quoted it from Briggs in a discussion. He says it's used two ways. He agreed that it's used two ways. The second way is when the divine person, like God, shows up and appears in a city, comes to a city where he's been absent from. He appears and he shows up and to deal with things that he alone can deal with. Now, the word is also translated one time when it concerns Paul, and it's actually translated as bodily presence. So it's always there, all the way across the board. Those two things. Parousia uses 24 times, 16 times concerning Jesus. So he is fully man, he is fully God, that never changes. He can appear according to the Old Testament. He can appear anytime he wants to, bodily or not bodily. That's not the issue. He can appear if he wants to. So when we talk about the nature and the timing, it doesn't matter if he showed up in AD 70 or he shows up 2,000 years later. That will never change how Paul taught that he was to appear. Correct? Real briefly, when we talk, then he talks in there. He goes to the next argument, about the day of the Lord. Well, anytime God came in judgment in the Old Testament was the day of the Lord. Now, let's go into this next quote, and Don says, virtually every scholar and Bible student recognizes that John's revelation is the reiteration of the prophecies of Daniel. This makes the time statements in Revelation devastating to all future spiritism. And that's just the problem. Every Bible scholar that I know of and every Bible student I know of, John's revelation is not a reiteration of the prophecies of Daniel. It's not. If Daniel's prophecies concerning that time up until 70 AD and Revelation written after, according to my beliefs, and what I've looked at through that, then it is much future in the time period, and it has nothing to do with the events of 70 AD. There is no temple needing to be built. It's never destroyed because, according to Zechariah 12 and 14, Jesus shows up in defense of Israel and gives the victory to Israel. Now, on to the next quote. However, if, as we are proposing, Jesus never predicted a visible return to end human history, then the time indicators that the New Testament can be taken as face value. Now, here's the thing. I agree. Jesus never predicted a physical, visible return to end human history. He never talked about that. The events of 70 AD were never about the ending of human history or the end of the world. It would be, in a sense, the end of the world of the Jews. Yes, that was the end of their world for now. And in that sense, apocalyptic language be absolutely appropriate, be used that way to talk about it. He says, further, the consistent use of metaphoric prophetic language can be honored, as if we've seen Jesus' promises to come in judgment as the Father had come precludes the idea of an end of history physical coming. In a nutshell, when we talk about end of history, when Jesus returns in the future's view, of course, he said, and I'm not amill, I am premill, so I make that distinction. And I won't get into why I'm not amill, but the idea for me comes from Revelations 20, where it shows and it talks about when the army comes against Jerusalem the second time, this other army, Satan is bound up in prison. Then you see the ones who were killed during the tribulation, they come to life. This is the first resurrection. The rest of the dead don't come to life until the 1,000 years are over. So that has to be a set end time. At least there has to be an end time. So if there's an end time, there's got to be a beginning time. And that beginning time, I would say and argue, is when Satan is thrown into a prison. And that's the very language that's being used there at the beginning of Revelation 20 about him being thrown into a pit. I'm just looking at a couple other comments here, seeing if anybody other had any questions or anything else like that. So now, in that Revelations 20, though, it goes on. What does it say right afterwards? Now, and I'm coupling this with Zechariah 12 and 14. In 12 and 14, especially the last verses there, and then everybody who survives of the nations will come year after year to Jerusalem to worship the King. Revelations 20. Satan being released gathers these armies, and what do? They march across the broad plain of the earth, and they surround and the actual Greek word is their barracks of the saints. And barracks, of course, is the idea where an army dwells. So he's kind of correlating that with the army that came with Jesus. Of course, this is the army. This is where they're barracking and dwelling, is in Jerusalem. And then he calls it in that very next verse, the city he loves. The city he loves has always been Jerusalem. Always been. So even here in this ending time frame, Christ, Zechariah 14, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. He will protect Israel on that day that he comes, and then it becomes a city that he dwells in, where the saints and the Jewish people together have become one people and are dwelling there. And then, of course, at the end of 1,000 years, Satan is released. He gathers another army, comes against, and fire comes down in the end. Satan is thrown now into the lake of fire, where or with the false prophet and the beast. Who and where were they thrown in? When Christ showed up, when he first came. That's when they were thrown in. So we have a time frame here. And of course, then what follows is the judgment, where everybody stands before the Lord and goes. But I won't go into that just here yet. So I'm looking at the quotes here. In reality, he goes back. In reality, the answer to the question is, when he's talking about the timing dictates the nature. And I've kind of resolved that, because we know that in the Old Testament he has come and he has appeared. In reality, the answer to the question is this. Time statements are consistently used prosaically, literally through the Bible. So the language of the day of the Lord is metaphorical. So therefore, that's why. Okay, what right does the student have to acknowledge the consistent metaphorical language of the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, and then insist that the identical language must now in the New Testament be understood literally? Here's the point, and here's the argument. When you're using metaphorical language, the sun and the moon be darkened, or whatever kind of language, it is being used to describe a real event. I don't know how much more different we can argue, or how much differently we can say that. It was always about a literal event that was happening. Jesus is coming, the armies, Jerusalem being destroyed. Even if you put that into Revelations and everything else, those are still literal events. The great white throne judgment, whether it happened in heaven or earth or wherever it happened, that was still a literal event. And so we're understanding that the metaphorical language is talking about literal events. So, of course, Don says, is that Jesus did not predict that he was coming at the end of human history, that he was coming physically on the clouds of the sky. And of course, this is all Matthew 23 or 24, and this is where he's combining 24 with Revelation. So that will always be all jammed together. So the parousia was to reveal Jesus as God, not man. This means Jesus could not appear as a man in the flesh. Why? Well, because of course he's arguing that flesh is evil. Therefore, if he's going to appear like God and spirit form like God, then therefore he cannot appear in the flesh. And we've proven and we've demonstrated through anthropology and the incarnation that Christ and scriptures that Christ is fully and still man. So when he appears as a man, he's going to be man and God. And here he goes on to the next quote that I bring out. God's modus operandi has always been from the natural to the spiritual. So the millennial view of a restored nation, okay, it's always been the natural to the spiritual, and we've told you that's Gnostic thought to apply that to it. In reality, what God has always done, it's natural, and there's a spiritual principle. There's always a natural, and the two of them live side by side and part of each other, and have always stuck together. Jesus declared, the kingdom does not come with observation. The kingdom is within you. This was stated direct. Jesus' throne was never predicted to be on earth, but in heaven. A great deal of ink is applied to trying to prove that Jesus must sit down in David's literal throne in Jerusalem. And he quotes a couple of the people here. Let's go to Acts 1. Now, I've written this out many a times and have talked about it, but I don't know how much it dawns on people or they interact with it. Of course, he wants to go to Acts 2 and argue anything, but let's go to this whole idea of Israel becoming a nation again, and Jesus coming down and being king over it and establishing an earthly throne and all that. When the apostles, when they had come together and they were walking, it says, when they had come together, they asked him in Acts 1:6, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Now, what's the question? Okay, so the Davidic prophecies were always about that, and this is what they understood, was that at some point, when the Messiah comes, he would sit and he would be a descendant of David, and he would sit on the throne of his father David on a restored kingdom of Israel. Israel would become its own nation again. Under that time, it was under Roman rule and control, and therefore they're looking for that to happen. In fact, and I'm going to tie this in with Palm Sunday. Think about it here for a second. So any Jewish literature, when they talk about the Messiah, they're talking about him becoming king and sitting on David's throne in Israel, being destroyed and returning to the greatness that it was during the time of Solomon and of David. So they're looking at this. And it was even the point of what Judas did. If I can force Jesus' hand, he'll have to defend himself. Then all of our followers and everything else will rise up and will join with him, and will, like in the days of Gideon and of the judges, where all of us got together again and we were able to rise up the armies and get rid of our oppressors. This is what they wanted to see, exactly what they wanted to see happen. And so they're asking, Lord, at this time, now that you've resurrected and all these things have happened, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Are we going to do that? See, they have no clue that he's getting ready to leave. And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons the Father has fixed by his own authority. So what's being implied there? He's saying, it's not for you to know that time or the season that's been fixed and set up by by God. God knows that there's a time for that to happen, but it's not for you to know when it is. All you need to know is it's going to happen. That's the implication. That is how we know. I mean, that is confirmation. I don't think Don ever deals with these verses or with that argument or understands all that or even thinks about that in that one sense. That is exactly what God is talking about, him restoring the kingdom and him coming. Now, getting back to, I'm looking at a couple of notes here and see if there's anybody else. Now, when we were talking about Epiphania and Parousia and his coming and everything else, this absolutely floored me, and it was in Don's other book, one of his other ones that he was talking about. I've got the quote. I can get it out later and everything else. But he talks about the word apantesis, the word meet, to meet him in the air. And he's talking about the rapture. And of course, he's arguing against the rapture. But when he starts talking about Ambenthesis, he goes back to the day of Palm Sunday. Now, here's the reminder of what happened on that day. And I want you to think about this. On that day that he came into Jerusalem, I'm going to use some deliberate language here. When he came to Jerusalem, what happened? His disciples went on ahead and did what? Announced to the people that he's coming. The king is coming. The king is riding in on a colt, not on a horse. Got that? That's got to be absolutely very important. A king who comes on a horse comes in war. A king who comes in colt comes in peace. Revelation 19, what is he coming in? On a war horse. Okay, so there's that distinction. But runners went ahead and announced to everybody he's coming and coming. And what did the city do? They ran out to meet him on the road. Where is he coming to? Jerusalem. So the people followed him in. This is also a demonstration of, in the Roman world, of what a parousia was, the royal visit of a king. Whenever the king came back, for instance, in triumph with his armies, what did he do? He led a procession in front of him of the slaves and the things that they captured. Runners would go ahead to the city, announce to everybody. All the inhabitants would come out and meet him on the road, and they had this parade going in. That's exactly Palm Sunday. That's exactly how how Paul is using the word parousia. The arrival, a royal visit is coming there. Secondly, when we talk about Epiphania, it was also used in the Roman world for something very specific. When Caesar, when the king sat on his throne, that was his Epiphania. That's when he was revealed as God. And you were to worship Caesar as God. That's when this man became God. And that's what this whole thing is all about. But of course, in his book, Don's book, what he's arguing against is that the dispensationalist idea of a rapture is that Jesus comes, takes everybody up, they meet him in the air, and then they go back to heaven. They don't ever come down. Don used this argument to prove that there's no such thing as a rapture where people are carried off, taken up into heaven, where they meet him and everything, and then they're just taken back to heaven. They don't come down to earth. And he used that Palm Sunday illustration, just as I have used, to demonstrate that's actually what meet means. And so I would sit there and say, why don't you apply what happened on Palm Sunday, that example, to how Christ comes and he comes in his kingdom? Absolutely fascinating, some of the comments that I see from him. Now, he says, and I'm going to, okay, in the next section here, Christ's coming was to reveal him in the glory of the Father. Jesus left the world of the flesh, never to enter it again. He entered once again into the world of the Father, the world of the light. And are we to ignore the fact that Paul said no man can see God, and the fact that Jesus was to be revealed as God? So we've already talked about that. No man can see God. Well, that's not true. God showed up. And anytime you saw Jesus, you saw God. The second thing, he was to be revealed as God and man. But never, and we've talked about left the world of the flesh. He ascended into flesh and bone body. And it lives in that. So let me bring up then, of course, I'm not even paying attention to time. It's now 7 o'clock, huh? It's only been an hour, so I can keep going. The idea is that there are two verses. Philippians 3:21, of course, he's going to change our lowly body to become like his glorious body. And then in Colossians 2:9, in him, in Christ, dwells the divine nature or the divine attributes, all of deity in bodily, in some translation, form. But in the Greek, it's just bodily, somatikos, dwells bodily. So the idea is that the divine nature dwells in heaven in its present tense, bodily. It's Paul who's using this language. His appearance would reveal him as Lord of Lords. His appearance was not a literal physical coming, bodily coming. And we're stating it has to be. Whether Well, because the minute he puts it with epiphania and says it's a visible manifestation, and Jesus has a body, you cannot say that Jesus is going to appear in the flesh. And here's the basic argument why you can't say that Jesus got rid of his flesh. And it comes from Romans 6:9. And this is worth reading and applying it and understanding this argument. And I know there was some discussion on Facebook with Sam and the others earlier about this point. But in Romans 6:9, come on, baby, it says, for one, let's go back so that no one longer be saying, verse 7, for one who has died has been set free from sin. So if I physically died, I have been set free from the bondage that my flesh is in because it's dead from sin. Now, if I have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. So we know that Christ, being raised from the dead, resurrected, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. Now, Sam has that verse. All of a sudden, I'm going blank on what it is. But the idea is that what is death? Death is the separation of the body from the spirit. That's physical death. When the body dies, the spirit leaves, it goes into the ground and becomes dust. That's physical death. So Christ, having died, being raised from the dead, will never die again. So what do we call that? See, beforehand, he was mortal. And those two words, mortal and imperishability, are both applied always to the flesh. It's never once used in Scripture concerning the spirit or anything else. It is always applied to the body. He will give life in Romans, life to our mortal bodies. And so again, in 1 Corinthians 15, we will be changed from mortal to immortal, from perishable to imperishable. And that's the key fact there. We're going through this change. So when Paul says flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom, but it must be changed, and we will change. When he comes in the twinkling of an eye, we will be changed. And the idea of inheriting is, here I am in this lowly, human, frail body. It cannot go into heaven and inherit and just become immortal. It just doesn't. It's not like an attribute that it's just been given, that it has, and follow along. The idea is there. We do not die. And he says that we do not fall asleep, which is a metaphor for death. He says we will be changed. We will go from immortal to from mortal to immortal, from perishable to imperishable. That is the change. So here in this verse, if he will never die again, that means he's now become immortal. Death no longer has dominion over him. Doesn't it say in Revelation that he has the keys to death and to life? And here's the next point you can put in here theologically. If Christ conquered death, he paid the ransom fee, he redeemed us from that other realm and all of that. In 33, with his resurrection, you have a resurrection in Matthew 27, 52, and 53 of physical people that came out. What does that mean then? That means that he was raised immortal. He is no longer subject to death. He is no longer, and it's talking then about his body that he was raised in. It was a glorified, resurrected, changed, immortal body. And of course, Don has to deny that, and he does in his book quite often. Now, let me get back. Okay. Okay, so we talked about that. So, thus, if Jesus' parousia was to reveal him as God and man, that's what he leaves out, that it can hardly be argued that he would be revealed as a 5-foot Jewish man of flesh and bone. Jesus is flesh and bone, 5'4", 5'6", whatever it is. That's how he's going to be revealed. Let me go to this next quote. Incarnation as a physical human being demands a physical parousia. Now he's quoting from somebody else. He further cites Ryrie. What Why is an earthly kingdom necessary? Did he not receive the inheritance when he was raised and exalted to heaven? Is not his present rule his inheritance? Why does there need to be an earthly kingdom? Because he must be triumphed in the same arena where he was seemingly defeated. His rejection by the rulers of this world was on this earth, and his exaltation must be on this earth. So he's quoting from somebody else and saying, I don't agree with that. Let me go on a couple more that would be more Pierceman would mourn. So, of course, he's in this next quote dealing with the Messiah who pierced him, according to Zechariah. He's tying it in with 1:7 because it was used both ways. And we're demonstrating, well, I won't get into that, I guess. Okay, here it is. He noted, he was talking about somebody else's argument. He said, it will be noted, of course, that the prophets also said the Lord would fight for Jerusalem in Zechariah 12:8. So how can this strange paradox be explained? How can the prophet say on the one hand that the city would be destroyed with 2/3 of people killed and only a remnant remain, and then turn around and say that Jerusalem will be defended by Jehovah? And the answer is to be found in two biblical truths. In Acts 2, Peter shows that Christ has been raised. No, that's a different quote. His answer to that is that what he brings out and what he wants to argue is that the Jerusalem that's being defended, the Jerusalem that's there is the New Jerusalem. And, of course, the one that's being destroyed and all that is the earthly. So he claims that this is two different earths that's talking about. But the language is too specific to be talking about two different ones. Now, I'm looking at a couple of quotes. I want to make sure I just want to get to ones that are really relevant to what we're doing here. Because I am starting to wrap things up and coming to the end of this. And here's the main point. This was one of the important things that I wanted to go across. Okay, every preterist and futurist will talk about Hebrews 9:28. And of course, in 26 and 24, it also talks, the whole passage there. But of course, Hebrews 9:28, that he will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, or apart from sin, but to bring salvation. Now, I had to read the book and I had to really look at it quite a few times to get this and finally figure out why is it he's denying the flesh and all of that. And of course, his basic presupposition and assumption, of course, is that flesh is sinful, not realizing that Adam was created in the garden. He was not created with the sinful nature. He was not created with the fallen nature that happened after he sinned. So the restoration of all things is getting back to, and the resurrection is about going back to that state as man was created, as Adam was created in the garden before the fall. That is the whole point. Excuse me there. So when he reads that verse, apart from sin, he adds in there the likeness of sinful flesh. What he's saying there, and he's adding these two things together. Now, remember I said 2 plus 2. 2 plus 2 equals 22. Here's where Don is doing this, and I'm going to read the quote. It is highly suggested, therefore, that Christ in his ascension, departing from the world of the flesh, entered the heavenlies once for all time. So, departing of the world of the flesh means he gave up his flesh when there is no scripture whatsoever that says that God changed. There's no scripture that says he's not in bodily form, that he gave up his body, that he is a spirit form. And there's no such thing as the idea of a spiritual body where the body is not made of flesh. That word spiritual there means of a heavenly nature. Meaning, for example, the manna that fell down, Paul calls that the spiritual food that they ate in the wilderness was manna. Well, why is it spiritual? Because it wasn't man-made. It wasn't of human origin. It was something that God brought down, but it was absolutely very physical, including the quail. When God had the quail come down, very physical, but it was spiritual food because it came and it was something that was given by the spiritual. I'm just using that as an example, but the word spiritual always means of the heavenly realm, something that comes from God's origin down here to man, and not something man-made. Okay? Entering the heavenly is once and for time. So Ellen White says that the force of Christ's entrance into the heavenly most place once means the implication is, however, that Christ, having offered himself as a sacrifice, does not return to earth, but remained in the holy place. Christ could not return to the world of his sacrifice. He had to be revealed, his parousia, as the minister of the heavenly of holies. So our argument, Don, he's saying, our argument then is that Jesus appeared in the likeness of sinful flesh to condemn sin in the flesh. God, the pre-incarnate word, became flesh and dwelt among men. Incarnation. That's why we talked about it at the beginning, why it's so important. However, his second appearing would be apart. Okay, two things I want to bring about here. He appeared, it says right there, he appeared the first time. When Jesus appeared the first time, did not he appear as man? Did not everybody see him? I'm got to plug in my power here so my phone doesn't go dead. There we go. Okay. So when he appeared the first time, did not everybody see him? Did not he appear? I mean, he deliberately uses that word. So when we come down to the verse 28, he says he will appear a second time. Why would this appearing, which is the exact same word, why would this appearing now be an invisible appearing? See, that doesn't make any sense. He's to appear in the spiritual realm and be revealed as God in the spiritual realm. And this is what Don Preston is arguing all the way through. And then he says what? The question is probate. Would the parousia be to reveal Christ once again in the likeness of sinful flesh, or to reveal him in the glory of the Father? See, of course, glory of the Father is coming from Matthew 24, which has nothing to do with his second coming. In his second coming, he has appeared the second time apart from sin. And what it means by apart from sin, he's not coming again to deal with the sin or the issue of sin. That is the bottom line. But Don adds in there the likeness of sinful flesh. What he adds is that to apart from sin, what he's saying is apart from the sinful flesh. He's adding those words in there in his interpretation. He's adding 2 + 2 and coming up with 22 because it's not talking about the sinful flesh. Think about it. Christ was resurrected in sinful flesh and ascended into heaven in sinful flesh. He dwells in the bodily realm in sinful flesh. No, that whole idea that if this is going to be the restoration of all things, and the resurrection was to be in life, then resurrection is about new life in Christ. It's about the restoration of what man was created to be, and that was body, soul, and spirit without sin. Get that? Without sin, without having that sin nature. That is where sin and death bite the bullet in the resurrection, because it can only happen because we are being resurrected into a body. And if we're being resurrected in a body, I plugged in my iPhone. My computer over here that hasn't worked on the sound for I don't know how long, all of a sudden decided to start working again. I'm kind of baffled on it. But the pre-fall body is the restoration. That is what resurrection is about, taking us back to that point in that place. Let me see if I'm missing anybody's comments or anything else like this. And I'm not seeing anything further. Okay. Going back then. So that's where we destroy his argument. That's where we talk it apart. And that's the basis of his assumption that carries out his interpretation, to say that sin is evil, and when God created man in the garden, it was good, and therefore it was not evil. He goes on to say, would reveal him alive in the spirit, in the realm of the spirit, or to put it another, it would reveal him him is pre-incarnate being his divinity. And I'm sorry, but the whole doctrine of the incarnation that was taught by scholars in theology all the way years, he never goes back to being a spirit being without a body. And the scripture says he has a glorious body. Jesus, or God, excuse me, has never said in the New Testament, Old Testament, anywhere that he has a glorious body. So therefore, he's in trouble. And this was Don Preston's problem when he showed at Criswell. He tried to say that God was in a bodily form. And if you go back, they might have taken it down by now, but in the question and answer after he presented himself to Criswell College and talked with them, he even submitted a paper there. In the question and answer, the professors there all told him, sorry, God is spirit. He can't have a spirit body. Jesus has a spiritual body, but it's still a body of flesh. And they told him, you need to go back and revisit that doctrine of the incarnation, what it is. But when he talks about him going back to the spirit, of course, not in the likeness of sinful flesh or anything like that, that is the Gnostic view. That is the denial of what the incarnation is. And that's where we have the problem with the theology. Jesus is going to appear in bodily form, and he's going to appear and manifest because he is fully God and fully man. And of course, the whole basis of this is full preterism, of course, says that Jesus returned in 70 AD. And our problem is that we don't have not one early father who ever said or suggested anything ever about Jesus returning in AD 70. They all said that Jesus came in judgment. That was, and using the language of Matthew 24, they all believe Matthew 24 was fulfilled. Eusebius, when he wrote in his work in book 3, he quotes Josephus and he talks about all this government, but it's also Eusebius who sat on the board of the Nicene Creed who formulated that Jesus is coming again. It's Clement who lived and wrote right after 70 AD in those early 150 years within 150 AD who said that Jesus is returning again. It's Barnabas, the same Barnabas that traveled with Paul, who comes back and says that Jesus will return in the future and that Jerusalem is destroyed according to the word of the Lord. I mean, you have all these statements. And this is what got me started in the study to begin with, and where I came up with the idea. I always was kind of a pre-mill, post-trib type of person. But this is where I saw it, and this is where I separated from dispensationalists and others. Looking at the church fathers and what they said, and then understanding how did they understand that. And it has to be that language that they don't ever believe that Matthew 24 ever talks about a second coming. Now, I'm skipping through a couple of things, and I think we're getting back. I'll find some. No. That pretty much covers the basis and of the whole book, and that's what I've looked at all the way through Kingdom and Earth, Cadet, Vindication of the Martyr from 6-9. Okay, I covered most everything, the basis of everything, and with those doctrines, because see, a lot of his arguments are going to be based on the implications of he's going to come in the glory of his Father, but Paul says Jesus himself descends out of heaven, that Jesus dwells in heaven in bodily form, that Jesus cannot, once he's been raised, cannot die again. And we know that in 70 AD, Jesus never appeared. It was never Jesus himself that showed up. Nobody ever claimed that he showed up. Nobody was changed. Nobody was raised immortal, changed immortal, or any of those things. So in order for you to say it happened when the whole church has been telling you that it was literal, of course, you're reading scripture and you're coming to the literal understanding that Christ dwells in heaven in bodily form. He's still fully God and fully man. You see these implications are based on these scriptures. But when Don Preston goes to argue, he goes to other verses and he never deals with it head on, specifically what epiphania means, what parousia means, He doesn't deal with it. And for those of you friends who are listening, who are kind of wondering where I'm at a little bit, let me give a little bit more context. And I thought there's some people here that have really don't know the full context of who Don Preston is or anything. And so let me just give a little brief on that. Preterism is a new doctrine that's coming up that believes and states that the second coming of Jesus and all prophecy and revelations was fulfilled in 70 AD. We have no further judgment to happen. There's no great white throne. There's no new heavens. All of that stuff happened in 70 AD. The full restoration to everything all happened in 70 AD. But of course, for them to do that, they have to spiritualize all these scriptures to make it come spiritual. Therefore, if it's all spiritual, then the physical is not right. That's evil. And you see a whole change in the hermeneutics of them to apply it. Now, the problem, of course, is that as much as I don't like to admit it, this doctrine is slowly growing to people, but it's creating such mass confusions. As I've pointed out, between William Bell and Jimmy Henry, you've got two men who are looking at the same scriptures and completely coming up with the same thing, but the one who is agreeing with me is not tying the fact that the Son of Man coming in clouds. Every time that passage or that phrasing is being used by Jesus in any other passage, he's talking about the same thing. And there's other issues and smaller issues. For instance, all things fulfilled. We're looking at Matthew, every jot and every tittle will be fulfilled and has to be fulfilled before, the end comes. And so therefore the end came in 70 and all prophecy, everything was all fulfilled based on that scripture. But Matthew was talking to a Hebrew audience. Luke wrote his gospel and he wrote it to a Greek audience. When Luke brought up the same scriptures, he said, it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one jot or tittle to pass from the law without it coming to pass. In Matthew, he didn't say easiest because he's using a common phrase, a Hebrew idiom. Like when hell freezes over, when pigs fly, it was a forming surgery. It's easier for heaven to earth to fade away than for God to be a liar and not fulfill his promises. And that's exactly what that verse means. But they take it literally and said all things had to be fulfilled. And because all things had to be fulfilled, then heaven and earth passed away. Therefore, the new heavens and earth came. Again, that's 2 + 2 = 22 thinking. And a lot of what I presented here and have given you tonight is traditional theology that's been handed down to us for 2,000 years, that has been here in the church and has been part of the church. Some of the core doctrines, yes, there are minor differences among some of the points, but that has been essentially it. And so I've gone through Don's book and I've talked about the nature of his coming can't be based on the Olivet. It has to be based on everything else that the apostles are talking about. And that's the important thing to remember and understand. So hopefully everybody will spark some questions and things else. You can ask questions and everything else. I'll be wrapping this up right now and coming to a close. I haven't seen any other comments come up. I guess you guys got it just going live. Me and my spelling. I use a spelling. I have to use a different keyboard. Sometimes there's a delay between I will type it and it all out and everything else, and I hit return and enter, and it'll post it, and then I'll go back and look. Oh crud! It got the CO, but then it didn't get the M, and now I got to go back and retype again. And people yell at me about my bad spelling, but I'm using a Bluetooth keyboard, and it's sometimes a little bit slow in the upkeep. So I apologize for sometimes for the spelling mistake. But anyway, I want to deal with predators because I want to have this laid out on record to point people to and interact with and create questions and things like this. So with all that said, nobody called Don a name, never called him an idiot or anything like this. We're not doing that. We're just saying that he's just missing some pieces and not putting together, and these presuppositions are allowing it. And the danger, of course, is that people are starting to believe it. There is a growth among people. I sometimes think that more people leave the position than those who stay in it and follow with it. But you've got now one school in Philadelphia that wants to base their curriculum on a house divided, preterist works. You've got other doctors now that are, following after it and abandoning it because it sounds good. And of course, anything that the enemy is going to give us is going to be a half truth and a half lie. And the truth is, and the part that I've told you that I agreed with, is that all of the Olivet was fulfilled in AD 70. But when you do the exegesis on Son of Man coming in clouds, it is not a promise of a second coming. That's exactly what Don argues about. It's not about a second coming down where Jesus appears and shows up. Where we learn about Jesus coming and appearing physically and bodily, we get it from the epistles. And everything has to be consistent and coherent. When you say that Jesus or God sent a Roman army to destroy Jerusalem, but yet Zechariah 12:14 says, on that day I protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem and I give strength to the Israel, to Jacob and everybody, and the nations that come against Israel are defeated. We have an inconsistency, and spiritualizing it is not the answer, because the language cannot be spiritualized when it says the inhabitants will have strength from the Lord. And anybody can go read Zechariah 12 and 14 just as easy. All right, I have gone on for an hour and a half now. Based on response, of course, from people, I will do this again if you want to, and hopefully we can get somebody to interact with us. If anybody has a suggestion about software that would make this integrate better, where we can add people on, something like what David Gates used, I don't know what it is, but if you want to send me recommendations, I can do it. I want to remind people that my website is middleism.org, and middleism is just a made-up word that I did just to create buzz and for people to be inquisitive and ask for it, because middleism has never been used to describe an eschatology before. So I'm strictly doing that just out of tongue in cheek, just to get people to look at it. But my website is middleism.org, and then you have my other website, blog and bookstore, which is elijahbones.com, where it's just general discussion about the church in general. You can go on there and chat, and then I've got the point of Elisha's Bones is, of course, is the idea of resurrection life, bring resurrection life into people's homes and into their lives, because what we do at home, our entertainment, the music that we listen to, the things that we see, the things that we have around our house, should put us into the mood and get us reflective of the fact that when we go out into the world, we are reflecting how we live our lives at home has to be the same how we live out in the world. God's got to be number one. And what we feed our spirits with has got to be life. And it's got to be goodness. What we watch on TV, movies. I'm not saying you're a sinner for watching something terrible. That's not what I'm saying. But what we should be feeding our souls with is with the good stuff and things that help and whole. There's got to be a balance in that. And so I'm bringing on the recommendations for music, good music, Christian music that we can put in, movies, books that we can learn to read that help us get a handle on things better, and then a clothing store and things like that, where T-shirts with the message of our faith, taking it out there. Okay, so thank you guys for being patient and listening through all of this. Those in the future who see it, I know it's an hour and a half. About an hour and 35 minutes going on and all that. So I appreciate you coming. Check out my YouTube channel, Stephen Whitsitt. You can go there. We have almost 60 more videos, and we're just going to keep this up because our goal is to present the other side in opposition to. So it's middleism apologetics that we are working on. Thank you guys for coming in. You have a good night, and I hope to hear from you later and questions. Thanks again. Good night.